Amidst the ruins of a once thriving Soviet city on the banks of the Volga, the fate of the world's greatest war was decided. The Battle of Stalingrad was not merely a clash of armies. It was a brutal test of endurance where rubble became trenches, factories turned into fortresses, and every street, building, and even stairwell was fought over in blood. Between the summer of 1942 and the winter of 1943, Adolf Hitler's mighty Wehrmacht and Joseph Stalin's Red Army engaged in a titanic struggle that cost over 2 million lives. From desperate last stands in crumbling apartment blocks to the thunder of Soviet counteroffensives, the story of Stalingrad is both horrifying and awe-inspiring. This is the moment when Nazi Germany's advance was stopped and the tide of World War II began to turn. This is the battle that saved Europe. This is Stalingrad. To understand Stalingrad, we must first understand how the war reached this pivotal point. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, began on June 22, 1941. It was the largest invasion in military history. Over 3 million German soldiers and Axis allies, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft, surged eastward across an 1,800-mile front. Hitler's objective was not just military conquest, but the destruction of the Soviet state and the enslavement of its people. This was a war of annihilation, a crusade against communism and Slavic peoples whom the Nazis considered subhuman. The stakes could not have been higher. In the opening months, the Wehrmacht achieved astonishing success. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and annihilated in vast pocket battles. German panzers rolled through Ukraine, Belarus, and deep into Russia with seemingly unstoppable momentum. Cities like Smolensk, Kiev, and Minsk fell in rapid succession. By October 1941, German troops stood at the gates of Moscow itself. The world held its breath, believing the Soviet Union might collapse within weeks. Western military analysts predicted Soviet defeat. Stalin's purges of the Red Army Officer Corps in the late 1930s had decapitated Soviet military leadership. The surprise of the invasion had caught Soviet forces unprepared and disorganized. Yet the Red Army did not break. Despite catastrophic losses, millions of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in the first 6 months, the Soviets fought on. They traded space for time, conducting fighting withdrawals that bloodied the advancing Germans. They scorched the earth as they retreated, denying resources to the invaders. In the winter of 1941-42, the Germans were repelled outside Moscow in a counteroffensive that shocked the world. Soviet Siberian divisions, fresh and well-equipped for winter warfare, struck the exhausted, freezing German armies. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had been stopped. The myth of German invincibility suffered its first major crack. But Hitler was far from defeated. He remained determined to crush the Soviet Union and seize its vast resources. In 1942, the German High Command turned its eyes southward, toward a prize that could change the course of the war. The summer of 1942 blazed across the Eastern Front. After the harsh winter battles outside Moscow, Hitler regrouped his forces for a new offensive. His eyes no longer focused solely on the Soviet capital. Instead, he aimed south toward two critical objectives: the oil-rich Caucasus and the strategic river city of Stalingrad. The new offensive was codenamed Case Blue, Fall Blau. Its objectives were ambitious and, if successful, potentially war-winning. First, secure the oil fields of Baku and Grozny in the Caucasus. These vast petroleum reserves would fuel Germany's war machine while denying them to the Soviets. Second, seize Stalingrad to cut Soviet communications along the Volga River, effectively severing the northern and southern halves of the Soviet Union. Hitler believed that controlling these resources would cripple the Soviet war effort while giving Germany the fuel to continue its conquests indefinitely. He was thinking strategically, economically, and fatally symbolically. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was chosen to lead the assault on Stalingrad. Behind him stood one of the finest armies ever assembled, experienced, battle-hardened veterans of earlier victories across Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. These were the men who had conquered nations. Their morale was high, for after more than a year of fighting, the Wehrmacht still appeared unbeatable. But cracks were already forming in the foundation of this confidence. The German supply lines stretched dangerously thin across the vast Russian landscape. Their allies, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions, were brave but less well-equipped and poorly trained compared to German units. These weaknesses, seemingly minor in the summer heat, would later prove fatal in the winter cold. In June 1942, German panzers thundered across the steppe. Dust rose in towering clouds as tanks, trucks, and even horse-drawn wagons pushed eastward. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, striking Soviet positions with devastating precision. Stukas screamed down to bomb and strafe retreating columns. Soviet forces, still reeling from the previous year's disasters, fell back under the relentless assault. The Germans captured Voronezh and swept toward the Don River. Villages and towns burned in their wake, leaving behind trails of destruction and civilian suffering. In their path lay the Red Army, retreating, yes, but not broken. They were regrouping, buying time, preparing for the defense of their homeland. By late August 1942, the Germans stood before Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial city stretched along the western bank of the Volga River. The city was vital for multiple reasons. Its factories produced tractors, tanks, and weapons, serving as a crucial lifeline for the Soviet war machine. Its position on the Volga made it a transportation hub connecting northern and southern Russia. And most importantly, it bore the name of Joseph Stalin himself, the Soviet leader. For Hitler, taking Stalingrad was not just a military objective but a symbolic one. Capturing Stalin's city would humiliate the Soviet dictator, boost German morale, and potentially break Soviet will to resist. Hitler became personally fixated on this prize, an obsession that would have catastrophic consequences. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed one of the most devastating bombing raids of the war. Wave after wave of German bombers filled the skies over Stalingrad. Thousands of tons of bombs fell on the city, reducing entire districts to smoking rubble. Fires raged for days, sending pillars of black smoke rising like funeral pyres over the Volga. Tens of thousands of civilians perished in the inferno. Women and children burned alive in their homes. Schools, hospitals, and apartment blocks collapsed into piles of shattered brick and twisted metal. The city's wooden structures were consumed in a firestorm that rivaled anything seen in the war. Yet what the Germans believed would be a quick conquest was about to turn into their worst nightmare. The very destruction they inflicted created an environment that favored defenders. The rubble that filled Stalingrad's streets created a natural fortress, a maze of ruins perfect for ambushes and close-quarters fighting. Instead of cowing the Soviet people, the devastation hardened their resolve. As Soviet propaganda thundered from loudspeakers and leaflets, "There is no land beyond the Volga," this became the rallying cry of Stalingrad's defenders. Behind them was the great river, and beyond that, the heart of Mother Russia. There would be no retreat. There could be no retreat. Stalin himself recognized the critical nature of the moment. On July 28, 1942, even before the Germans reached Stalingrad, he issued one of the most infamous orders of the war, Order number 227, known simply as "Not One Step Back." The order was brutal in its directness. Any soldier who retreated without orders faced execution. Entire blocking detachments were placed behind Soviet front lines with orders to shoot deserters and fleeing soldiers. Penal battalions were formed from accused cowards and criminals, sent on suicide missions to redeem themselves through blood. Harsh as it was, and it was extraordinarily harsh, the order symbolized the determination that would define the Soviet defense. The city would be defended at any cost. Every street, every building, every room would be contested. Surrender was not an option. Retreat was forbidden. Victory or death, there was no middle ground. Under the command of General Vasily Chukov, the Soviet 62nd Army prepared to resist the German onslaught. Chukov was a hard, ruthless man, perfectly suited for the brutal kind of warfare Stalingrad demanded. He was a soldier's soldier, tough, profane, and utterly dedicated to holding the city regardless of the cost. Civilians who had not been evacuated were pressed into service. They dug trenches that snaked through the ruins. They laid mines in streets and buildings. They carried ammunition to the front lines under fire. Women, old men, and even children all played their part in the city's defense. Workers in Stalingrad's massive factories continued producing weapons even as bombs fell around them. At the tractor factory, tanks rolled off assembly lines and were driven straight into battle, sometimes with factory workers still manning the guns. At the Red October steel plant and the Barricadi ordnance factory, production continued amid artillery fire and air raids. This was total war in its purest form. An entire city transformed into a fortress, every citizen a soldier, every building a bunker. As Paulus's Sixth Army crossed the Don and pushed toward the city, the world watched with bated breath. Newspapers in Berlin declared that Stalingrad would soon fall, that Soviet resistance was crumbling. But in Moscow, Stalin was preparing for a fight to the death. And in Stalingrad itself, defenders were digging in among the ruins, waiting for the Germans to come. The stage was set. In September 1942, the German Sixth Army would enter Stalingrad, and the greatest battle of the Second World War was about to explode. September 1942. The German Sixth Army, confident from months of victories, entered the outskirts of Stalingrad expecting another swift triumph. A city already crushed beneath the Luftwaffe's bombs, its defenders scattered and demoralized. What they encountered instead was hell on earth. Stalingrad was no longer a city in any traditional sense. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to mountains of rubble. Factories stood as skeletal remains, their walls shattered but their steel frameworks still looming against the smoke-filled sky. Streets were clogged with debris, burned-out vehicles, and the corpses of civilians who had not escaped the initial bombing. Yet, paradoxically, the destruction favored the defenders. Every pile of bricks became a barricade. Every ruined basement became a bunker. Every shattered apartment block became a fortress. The Germans quickly discovered that their tanks and artillery, which had served them so brilliantly on the open steppe, were nearly useless in the city's narrow streets and ruins. At first, German infantry pushed forward with their characteristic confidence. Backed by tanks and artillery, they advanced through the shattered western districts of Stalingrad. By mid-September, they had captured much of the city's outskirts and were pressing toward the Volga's western bank. But as they advanced deeper into the ruins, resistance stiffened dramatically. Soviet snipers materialized from the shadows of ruined buildings, firing with deadly precision before vanishing into the rubble. Mines and booby traps slowed every advance. Entire German squads disappeared in carefully planned ambushes staged from basements and attics. A German officer wrote in his diary, capturing the nightmare, "Every street is a fortress. Every house is a machine gun nest. The enemy hides everywhere. And when we clear one building, they emerge from the sewers behind us. This is not war. This is the end of the world." The defenders of Stalingrad were the men of the 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chukov. His headquarters was often nothing more than a dugout on the Volga's bank, constantly under bombardment. Chukov ordered his soldiers to fight not for meters of ground but for each wall, each staircase, each room. His strategy was called hugging the enemy. Soviet troops fought at such close range to German positions that German artillery and air support became useless, unable to fire without hitting their own men. Sometimes the distance between opposing forces was measured in meters, sometimes in the thickness of a single wall. The great factories of Stalingrad, the Red October steel plant, the Barricadi ordnance factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, became apocalyptic battlegrounds. Soldiers fought among assembly lines and around half-finished tanks. They exchanged grenades across workshops filled with molten steel and twisted machinery. Production equipment became cover. Blast furnaces became defensive positions. The fighting in Stalingrad was unlike anything the world had seen before. This was not warfare as understood by military theory. This was something primal and savage, combat reduced to its most brutal essence. One of the most famous aspects of the Battle of Stalingrad was the emergence of sniper warfare as a decisive tactical element. Soviet marksmen such as Vasily Zaitsev became legends, symbols of resistance and skill. Hidden in the rubble with careful camouflage and infinite patience, these snipers picked off German officers, tank crews, and machine gunners with terrifying efficiency. Zaitsev is credited with over 200 kills during the battle, though the exact number remains disputed. What's undeniable is that his exploits became a massive morale booster for Soviet soldiers and civilians alike. The Germans deployed their own expert marksmen in response, leading to deadly duels fought across the ruins. Snipers would wait for days for a single shot, studying their enemies' habits, learning the terrain, preparing their positions with meticulous care. A flash of movement, a moment of carelessness, and death would come invisibly from the ruins. Unlike conventional battles with clear front lines and defined positions, Stalingrad had no such organization. Germans might hold the ground floor of a building while Soviets controlled the upper floors, with savage fighting raging in the stairwells between them. In some cases, opposing forces occupied different rooms of the same apartment, separated only by a wall, listening to each other breathe. Sewer tunnels beneath the city became highways for Soviet troops, allowing them to appear behind German lines unexpectedly, to reinforce embattled positions, or to evacuate wounded. The sewers became a nightmarish subterranean battlefield where soldiers fought in darkness, waist-deep in filthy water. Grenades, knives, bayonets, and even sharpened entrenching tools became as important as rifles in the close-quarters combat. Ammunition was precious, and many soldiers learned to kill silently, creeping through ruins in the darkness to cut throats or bludgeon sentries. German soldiers gave this savage urban warfare a name: Rattenkrieg, rat war. They felt like rats, fighting in the darkness, filth, and ruins, never knowing where the enemy lurked, where the next attack would come from. Despite being surrounded on three sides and pushed back against the Volga, the Soviets maintained a crucial lifeline across the river. At night, under heavy German artillery fire, small boats and barges ferried reinforcements, ammunition, and supplies to the defenders. These crossings were deadly. Many boats were hit by shells or caught by searchlights and machine-gunned. Thousands of soldiers of the Red Army made the crossing, often without rifles, told they would pick up weapons from the fallen once they reached the western bank. Many never made it. Those who did went straight into battle, thrown into the inferno without rest or preparation. Women and children helped unload supplies at the river crossings, working under constant fire. Nurses evacuated wounded soldiers back across the Volga, often under German aerial strafing. Soviet anti-aircraft crews, many of them young women barely out of their teens, manned their guns until they were destroyed, buying precious time for the defenders. By late September, the Germans controlled much of Stalingrad's center. The Soviet defenders were pushed back to a thin strip of land along the Volga's western bank, sometimes only a few hundred meters deep. Yet still, incredibly, they refused to break. For the Germans, every city block captured cost hundreds of lives. For the Soviets, every meter of ground lost was bought back with rivers of blood. The city had become a meat grinder consuming armies. General Chukov later recalled, "We defended not a city, but every brick, every beam, every piece of soil. We buried our dead in the ruins and fought on over their bodies." The worst, however, was still to come. Because while the world watched the brutal street fighting consume Stalingrad, the Soviets were preparing something far more ambitious than mere defense. They were preparing a trap. By October 1942, Stalingrad had become a landscape from a nightmare. The Luftwaffe continued to pound the ruins daily. German artillery leveled what little remained standing. The Volga itself seemed to run red with blood. So many bodies floated in its waters. Yet the Soviet defense did not falter. Instead, it hardened into an iron will that became one of the defining features of the battle. The defenders of Stalingrad lived like phantoms among the rubble. Many had no proper shelters, sleeping in basements filled with dust, debris, and the overwhelming stench of the dead. Thousands of corpses lay unburied in the ruins, Soviet, German, civilian, decomposing in the autumn heat and then freezing in the winter cold. Rats swarmed through Stalingrad in biblical numbers, feeding on corpses. Soldiers woke to find rats gnawing on their boots or on wounded comrades. The psychological horror of the environment was as devastating as the physical danger. Ammunition was scarce, rationed carefully. Food often consisted of meager portions of bread mixed with sawdust to stretch supplies, or thin soup made from whatever could be found, sometimes boiled leather belts or boots when nothing else was available. Civilians who had not been evacuated before the battle fought alongside soldiers. Women worked as medics, snipers, scouts, and supply runners. They darted across open streets under fire, carrying ammunition or dragging wounded soldiers to cover. Even children were pressed into service, carrying messages, acting as lookouts, or helping with simple tasks that freed adults for combat. A Soviet survivor later recalled, "We had nothing but rubble and corpses around us, but still we would not let them take the city. We would rather die in the ruins than let Hitler claim Stalingrad." For the Germans, the battle transformed from rapid conquest into a grinding war of attrition that consumed men at an appalling rate. The Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus found itself bleeding divisions white trying to capture rubble. Every time a factory or building was finally taken after days of fighting, Soviet counterattacks would claw it back in a night. Entire companies of German soldiers, 200 men strong, were wiped out trying to seize a single city block. Battalions vanished fighting for individual buildings. The psychological toll was devastating. Soldiers who had marched confidently across Europe now found themselves trapped in an urban nightmare where death lurked in every shadow. General Paulus, a methodical and cautious commander, wrote in increasingly desperate reports, "Our losses are beyond anything we have experienced. Each street consumes battalions. Each house devours a company. The enemy will not yield." The German troops, exhausted and increasingly demoralized, gave names to key strongpoints, names that would enter military legend. The grain elevator, Pavlov's house, the Red October factory. These places became synonymous with death, monuments to the savage fighting that consumed Stalingrad. One of the most famous examples of Soviet resilience was a 4-story apartment building that became known as Pavlov's house, named after Sergeant Yakov Pavlov who commanded its defense. In late September 1942, Pavlov and a small assault group, fewer than 30 men, seized the building which overlooked a strategic square in central Stalingrad. The Germans immediately recognized its tactical importance and launched repeated assaults to recapture it. For nearly 2 months, Pavlov and his men held off the German attacks. They fortified the building ingeniously, creating firing positions in every window, laying mines around the perimeter, stringing barbed wire, and connecting basements to adjacent ruined buildings for evacuation routes and resupply. The defenders included not just Russians, but a true cross-section of the Soviet Union, Ukrainians, Georgians, Uzbeks, Tatars, Jews, all fighting together. At night, boats would risk the Volga crossing to bring them ammunition, food, and reinforcements for their losses. The Germans threw everything at Pavlov's house. Tanks, artillery, infantry assaults, even Stukas diving from the sky. The building was hit thousands of times. Its walls were pockmarked with bullet holes and shell impacts. Floors partially collapsed. Yet it stood firm and, more importantly, its defenders held. It was said among Soviet soldiers, with only slight exaggeration, that the Germans suffered more casualties trying to take Pavlov's house than they had suffered taking the entire city of Paris in 1940. The building became a symbol proof that determined defenders with limited resources could hold against overwhelming force. It inspired other units throughout Stalingrad. If Pavlov could hold a single building for months, then every soldier could hold their position, no matter the odds. The industrial districts of northern Stalingrad became battlefields unlike any the world had seen. The three great factories, the tractor factory, the Barricadi ordnance plant, and the Red October steel works, turned into fortified complexes where fighting raged day and night. In the tractor factory, workers had continued assembling T-34 tanks until German infantry literally reached the assembly halls. Then, in surreal scenes, half-finished tanks were crewed by a mix of workers and soldiers and driven straight from the factory floor into battle, sometimes without complete armor or even proper weapons. The Barricadi factory was fought over inch by bloody inch. German troops would capture workshops during daylight assaults, only to be pushed out at night by Soviet counterattacks. The same ground changed hands repeatedly, sometimes 5 or 6 times in a single week. The roar of machinery that had once filled these factories was replaced by the thunder of grenades, the chatter of machine guns, and the screams of dying men. Blast furnaces that had forged steel for Soviet industry now provided cover for desperate firefights. At the center of this inferno stood General Vasily Chukov, commander of the 62nd Army. His command post was often nothing more than a bunker dug into the Volga's bank, constantly under bombardment. Shells would rain down, collapsing sections of his headquarters, burying staff officers. Chukov would simply dig out and continue directing the defense. He rarely slept, driving his men with relentless determination. He issued stark orders: not one step back. Soldiers are to hold their ground or die where they stand. Desertion or unauthorized retreat was punished by immediate execution. Blocking detachments behind Soviet lines enforced these draconian measures. Harsh as these tactics were, they reflected the desperate reality of Stalingrad. To give ground was to invite collapse, and Chukov would not allow collapse. His will became the will of his army: to resist, to endure, to make the Germans pay in blood for every meter. The Soviet defenders paid dearly. Casualties were staggering. Companies of 200 men were often reduced to a dozen survivors after a week of fighting. Yet replacements, raw recruits, militia, even walking wounded sent back to the front, constantly filled the gaps. The Volga crossing remained the lifeline. Every night, boats risked the deadly passage. Many were hit by artillery or caught in searchlight beams and machine-gunned. Those that made it across often brought soldiers who went into battle immediately, sometimes without weapons, told to take rifles from fallen comrades. Despite their suffering, the Soviets had accomplished something extraordinary by November 1942. They had halted the German advance. The Wehrmacht controlled about 90 of Stalingrad, but the Soviets still held critical positions along the Volga, preventing total German victory. The Germans had expected to take the city in weeks. Instead, they were trapped in a months-long bloodbath that was consuming their strength. The harsh Russian winter was approaching. Supplies were running thin. And far to the north and south, in the frozen steppe beyond Stalingrad, Soviet armies were quietly assembling for something far more ambitious than defense. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army was exhausted, bled white by weeks of brutal urban combat. General Friedrich Paulus had committed virtually all his combat strength into the inferno of Stalingrad itself, focusing entirely on capturing the city. This meant his flanks, stretching hundreds of miles across the steppe both north and south of the city, were dangerously exposed. And these flanks were not held by elite German troops. Instead, they were guarded by Germany's allies: Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians. These allied soldiers were often brave and willing, but they lacked modern equipment. Romanian divisions had outdated anti-tank guns useless against Soviet T-34s. They had fewer artillery pieces, less ammunition, and inferior training compared to German units. Against the Red Army's growing strength, they were woefully vulnerable. While the world's attention remained fixed on the street fighting in Stalingrad, something remarkable was happening beyond the city. The Soviets were quietly, methodically assembling massive reserves. Entire armies, hidden in the snow and fog of the steppe, prepared to strike. Joseph Stalin and his high command, the Stavka, had devised a bold plan. It was not merely to relieve pressure on Stalingrad's defenders, but to encircle and destroy the entire German Sixth Army. The operation was codenamed Uranus, after the ancient god who devoured his own children, a grimly appropriate metaphor. In the frozen November nights, trains thundered across the Soviet Union's vast rail network, delivering fresh troops, tanks, and artillery to secret staging grounds north and south of Stalingrad. The forces being assembled were staggering. Over 1 million soldiers, 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, 1,115 aircraft. Among these forces were elite formations: the 5th Tank Army under General Romanenko and the 51st Army under General Vatutin. These were not the battered, desperate troops clinging to Stalingrad's ruins. These were fresh divisions, well-equipped and trained for mobile warfare. The Soviets employed masterful deception, maskirovka in Russian military terminology. They concealed their preparations behind camouflage nets and dummy positions. They maintained strict radio silence to avoid German signal intelligence. They conducted false maneuvers to mislead German aerial reconnaissance. German intelligence, stretched thin and overconfident, failed to detect the scale of the threat. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs, when they could fly through increasingly hostile skies, showed what appeared to be scattered defensive positions. In reality, entire tank armies lurked behind those positions, waiting for the order to attack. Inside Stalingrad, Paulus's men fought house to house, convinced that victory was only weeks or perhaps days away. Few realized that the hunters were about to become the hunted. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the silence of the frozen steppe was shattered by a colossal Soviet artillery barrage. It was one of the most devastating bombardments in military history, thousands of guns firing simultaneously in a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. Shells rained down on the Romanian Third Army, which was defending the northern flank of the German position. The bombardment was so intense that entire sections of the Romanian line simply ceased to exist. Trenches collapsed. Command posts were obliterated. Communications were cut. Survivors huddled in shell holes, deafened and traumatized. When the barrage finally lifted after 80 minutes of hell, waves of Soviet tanks and infantry surged forward through the smoke and snow. T-34 tanks, superior to most German armor and vastly better than anything the Romanians possessed, crushed through defensive positions. Soviet infantry in white winter camouflage swarmed behind the armor. Within hours, the Romanian lines collapsed. Entire divisions disintegrated as Soviet armor poured through the breaches. Romanians abandoned their positions and fled eastward in panic. German reports spoke frantically of chaos. The Romanians are fleeing. Our flank is wide open. Request immediate reinforcements. The next day, November 20th, 1942, the southern pincer struck. The Soviet 51st Army and 57th Army, supported by mechanized corps, attacked the Romanian 4th Army Corps near the Oxai River south of Stalingrad. Once again, the lightly armed Romanian defenders were overwhelmed. They fought bravely. Many Romanian units stood and died in their positions, but they simply lacked the weapons to stop Soviet tanks. Anti-tank guns that worked against older tank models bounced harmlessly off T-34 armor. Soviet tanks smashed through with devastating effect, driving north and west toward their objective, the town of Kaluk on the Don River west of Stalingrad. If the northern and southern pincers could meet there, the entire German Sixth Army would be encircled. German commanders, shocked by the speed and scale of the Soviet offensive, pleaded desperately with higher command for permission to retreat from Stalingrad before the encirclement was complete. Paulus himself requested authorization to withdraw westward while there was still time. But Hitler, fixated on capturing the city named after his enemy, issued unequivocal orders. The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad. It will be supplied by air if necessary. It will not retreat under any circumstances. For 4 days, the Soviet pincers drove relentlessly across the frozen steppe. Tank columns raced over the snow, moving day and night. Soviet infantry rode on the hulls of tanks or in following trucks, advancing at speeds that shocked the Germans. Supply wagons and mobile field kitchens rumbled behind, keeping the offensive fed and fueled. Villages were swept through without pause. Retreating Axis forces were scattered and overrun. Small German units tried to establish defensive positions but were bypassed or crushed. The momentum was unstoppable. On November 23, 1942, at approximately 4 p.m., the two Soviet spearheads met near Kalik, west of Stalingrad. Soldiers from the northern southwestern front and the southern Stalingrad front embraced in the snow, firing celebratory flares into the darkening sky. The jaws of the trap had closed. The German Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, along with Romanian and Croatian auxiliaries, was encircled inside what would become known as the Stalingrad Pocket or the Kessel, cauldron in German. Inside the pocket, German soldiers could scarcely believe the news. One moment they were fighting to capture factory buildings, believing victory was near. The next moment, they were cut off, surrounded by Soviet armies on all sides. The psychological shock was profound. Morale, already strained by months of brutal fighting, plummeted. Supplies, which had been adequate if not abundant, suddenly became critical. The pocket was supplied by only what it contained, and that would have to sustain the army until relief came. But relief was not coming. And Hitler's promise that the Luftwaffe could supply the Sixth Army by air was about to prove catastrophically false. November 23, 1942, the day the Soviet pincers met at Kalik, marked the beginning of the slow death of the German Sixth Army. Over 300,000 Axis troops were now trapped in a vast pocket stretching across Stalingrad and the surrounding steppe. At first, many German soldiers expected an immediate order to break out westward and escape the encirclement. It was the obvious move, the only move that made military sense. Every hour of delay made the Soviet ring stronger and German forces weaker. General Friedrich Paulus himself recognized this as the only chance for survival. He requested permission to attempt a breakout while the Soviet forces were still thin in some sectors. His commanders on the ground pleaded for authorization to fight their way west. But from Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair deep in East Prussia, came an unequivocal order. The Sixth Army will stand fast. It will be supplied by air. Stalingrad will be held at all costs. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, assured the Führer that his air force could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day to the encircled army, enough to sustain it indefinitely. This promise, made with typical Göring bombast and complete ignorance of the reality on the ground, sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. In reality, the battered Luftwaffe could barely manage 100 tons of supplies on the best days. Winter storms, mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and increasingly aggressive Soviet fighters made flights into the pocket perilous. Many transport aircraft were shot down. Others crashed in blizzards or were forced to turn back. The supplies that did make it through were often absurdly inappropriate: crates of condoms, summer uniforms, or other useless items sent by a collapsing logistics system. Instead of bread and ammunition, starving soldiers received cases of marjoram or pepper. These logistical disasters became bitter jokes among the freezing, hungry troops. By December, food rations had collapsed to catastrophic levels. German soldiers were surviving on 200 to 300 calories per day, less than a quarter of what a human body needs to function, let alone to fight in sub-zero temperatures. Horses, which had transported supplies and artillery, were slaughtered for meat. Every horse in the pocket was eventually eaten. Then soldiers turned to anything they could find. Leather belts and boots were boiled for whatever nutrition could be extracted. Men chewed on frozen sawdust mixed into bread. The starvation was compounded by the brutal Russian winter. Temperatures in the pocket plunged to -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit, and even lower. German soldiers, many still wearing thin summer uniforms because winter gear had never arrived in sufficient quantities, froze by the thousands. Frostbite became epidemic. Fingers and toes turned black. Limbs had to be amputated without anesthesia, without proper surgical instruments, often with nothing more than a saw and vodka for pain relief. Thousands of men lost hands, feet, or entire limbs to the cold. The wounded lay in unheated cellars and dugouts, groaning in the darkness. Medical supplies ran out within weeks. Morphine vanished. Bandages were reused until they fell apart. Gangrene spread unchecked through the wounded, the telltale smell of rotting flesh becoming commonplace. A German medic later wrote in haunting simplicity, "We could do nothing. They froze. They starved. They screamed until their voices broke. Then they were silent." Snowstorms transformed the pocket into a white graveyard. Corpses littered the frozen landscape, stacked like cordwood because the ground was too frozen to dig graves. The living trudged past the dead, too weak to bury them, too numb to care. As food vanished entirely, soldiers fought over scraps. A piece of bread baked with sawdust became a treasure worth killing for. Dead horses were skinned within minutes of falling, their meat boiled in rusty helmets over precious fires. Dark rumors spread through the pocket, whispered tales of cannibalism, of the living feeding on the dead. Official records remained silent on this horror, but the desperation was absolute. When humans are reduced to choosing between death and unspeakable acts, some will choose survival at any cost. Despite the unimaginable suffering, military discipline in many units somehow held. Soldiers continued to dig trenches in the frozen earth, to repair weapons with numb fingers, to obey orders even as hope died. But morale was crumbling like the ruins of Stalingrad itself. Some German officers began to whisper about surrender, but Hitler's orders remained absolute. Fight to the last bullet, to the last man. Field Marshal Paulus, ever the obedient officer, refused to defy his Führer even as his army disintegrated around him. Executions of defeatists continued. Men caught suggesting surrender were shot by military police or by officers desperate to maintain order. Fear of being labeled a coward, fear of dishonoring Germany, fear of what would happen to their families back home. These fears bound the army together even as starvation and cold tore it apart. Outside the pocket, the German High Command scrambled to organize a relief operation. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant commanders, was tasked with breaking through the Soviet encirclement and rescuing the Sixth Army. In mid-December 1942, Manstein launched Operation Winterstorm, Unternehmen Wintergewitter. His armored spearheads, including the powerful 4th Panzer Army, drove northeast toward Stalingrad from positions south of the pocket. The operation initially made good progress. German tanks smashed through Soviet defensive lines, driving closer to the encircled army. By December 19th, Manstein's forces had reached the Mishkova River, only 30 miles from Stalingrad's southern perimeter. 30 miles. So close that the sounds of Manstein's artillery could be heard inside the pocket. Hope flared among the trapped soldiers. Rescue was coming. But Paulus faced a terrible dilemma. To link up with Manstein's relief force, the Sixth Army would need to break out of the pocket, fighting westward to meet the rescuers. This would mean abandoning Stalingrad, abandoning the positions Hitler had ordered held at all costs. Paulus requested permission to attempt the breakout. Manstein urged him to act immediately, arguing that Winterstorm could only succeed if the Sixth Army fought its way toward the relief force. But Hitler's response was unequivocal. The Sixth Army will remain in position. It will hold Stalingrad. Relief will come to you. Paulus, conditioned by years of military obedience, obeyed. The Sixth Army remained in the pocket while precious days slipped away. And those days proved fatal. The Soviets, recognizing the threat of winter storm, rushed reserves to block Manstein's advance. Fresh Soviet tank armies held in reserve for exactly this contingency counterattack. The German relief force, overstretched and exhausted, ground to a halt at the Mishkova River. Then the Soviets launched a new offensive far to the northwest, threatening to encircle Manstein's entire relief force. Faced with the potential loss of his armies, Manstein had no choice but to order a retreat. Operation Winter Storm had failed. The distance of 30 miles might as well have been 300. The Sixth Army would not be rescued. Stalingrad's garrison was condemned to death. By January 1943, the situation inside the pocket had become apocalyptic. The once mighty Sixth Army was a ghost of itself. Out of the original 330,000 men, fewer than 100,000 were still capable of fighting, and capable is generous. Most were walking skeletons, barely able to hold a rifle. The Soviet noose tightened daily. Operation Ring, the Soviet offensive to crush the pocket, began on January 10th with another massive artillery barrage. Wave after wave of Soviet infantry and tanks assaulted the shrinking German perimeter. Entire German divisions disintegrated within hours. Units that had fought for months in Stalingrad simply ceased to exist. The pocket shrank from hundreds of square miles to a few dozen square miles, then to mere square miles around the city itself. The Germans were no longer defending a city. They were clinging desperately to piles of rubble, waiting for the end. Even as the situation became hopeless, Hitler refused to allow surrender. From his distant headquarters, safe and warm, he continued to issue delusional orders demanding the Sixth Army hold its ground. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal. The cynicism of this gesture was transparent. No German field marshal had ever surrendered in the field. Hitler expected Paulus to either continue fighting to annihilation or take his own life rather than face capture. But Paulus, despite his loyalty, was not suicidal. He was a soldier, not a fanatic. He knew the battle was lost. He knew continued resistance meant only more pointless death. On January 31st, 1943, Soviet troops broke into the German headquarters in the basement of a department store in southern Stalingrad. There they found Field Marshal Paulus and his staff, disheveled, exhausted, defeated. Paulus offered no resistance. When asked if he surrendered, he replied carefully that while he personally was now in Soviet custody, he had not officially ordered the army to surrender. This semantic distinction allowed him to technically claim he hadn't violated Hitler's orders, though in practice the distinction was meaningless. The southern pocket, about 90,000 men, surrendered with Paulus. For these soldiers, the nightmare of battle ended, only to be replaced by the nightmare of Soviet captivity. 2 days later, on February 2, 1943, the northern pocket under General Karl Strecker also collapsed. Strecker's last radio message to Germany was chillingly brief. The 11th Army Corps has fought to the last man. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The silence that fell over the ruins was almost as terrible as the noise that had preceded it. The surrender marked the single greatest disaster in German military history up to that point. Of the 330,000 Axis troops trapped in the pocket, only 91,000 went into Soviet captivity. The rest, nearly 240,000 men, had been killed in combat, frozen to death, or starved. But captivity was no salvation. Soviet prisoner-of-war camps were brutal. Prisoners received minimal food, no medical care, and were subjected to forced labor in conditions that claimed thousands of lives monthly. Of the 91,000 German prisoners taken at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 ever returned to Germany. Most died within months of capture. Some survived years of captivity only to die before repatriation. The last German prisoners weren't released from Soviet camps until the mid-1950s, more than a decade after the battle. For the Soviets, victory came at a staggering price. The Red Army suffered over 1.1 million casualties, killed, wounded, or missing in the defense of Stalingrad and the subsequent encirclement operations. Another estimated 40,000 to 50,000 Soviet civilians died during the battle. The city itself was obliterated. Not a single building stood intact. The industrial districts were moonscapes of twisted metal and shattered brick. The Volga's banks were choked with debris and bodies. Stalingrad had been transformed from a thriving city into a graveyard. Yet from this destruction emerged a turning point in world history. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. For the first time in the war, an entire German field army had not just been stopped but completely destroyed. The psychological impact rippled across the world. For the Allies, it was a beacon of hope. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called it the end of the beginning, the moment when the tide began to turn from defense to offense. The Soviet Union, which many had expected to collapse in 1941, now stood defiant and victorious. In Nazi Germany, however, the psychological blow was profound. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels tried to spin the defeat as heroic sacrifice, creating a Stalingrad myth that emphasized duty, loyalty, and martyrdom. But no amount of propaganda could disguise the magnitude of the disaster. German families received no official casualty lists. Letters from soldiers simply stopped arriving. Quietly, without fanfare, hundreds of thousands of families learned they would never see their sons, husbands, fathers, or brothers again. For the first time, ordinary Germans began to seriously question whether the war could be won. Doubt crept into conversations, whispered in kitchens and workplaces. The absolute confidence of earlier years began to crack. Stalingrad itself became a symbol that transcended its military significance. For the Soviets, it represented the triumph of collective will over fascist aggression. Soviet propaganda portrayed it as a city that refused to bow, a testament to socialist resilience. After the war, Stalingrad was rebuilt, though renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization. Monuments rose from the ashes, most notably the massive Motherland Calls statue on Mamiev Kurgan, the hill that had been so fiercely contested during the battle. At 85 meters tall, the sword-wielding female figure became one of the world's most iconic war memorials. The victory at Stalingrad gave the Soviet Union confidence and momentum it never lost. Within months, the Red Army would launch new offensives across the Eastern Front. In July 1943, they would defeat the Germans at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, ending any German hopes of regaining the initiative in the east. From Stalingrad onward, the Red Army pushed relentlessly westward through Ukraine, into Poland, and eventually to Berlin itself. The Wehrmacht would fight desperately for 2 more years, but it would never regain its strategic offensive capability. The battle also strengthened Stalin's position domestically and internationally. The Soviet dictator, who had feared collapse in 1941, now stood as one of the central figures of the Allied coalition. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, Stalin reminded Roosevelt and Churchill that it was Soviet blood that had broken the back of the German Wehrmacht. For Germany, Stalingrad marked the beginning of a long, catastrophic retreat. Hitler's prestige among his generals was permanently damaged. His refusal to allow retreat, his insistence on holding ground at all costs, had condemned an entire army to destruction. Even loyal officers began to see his strategic judgment as fatally flawed. This erosion of confidence would eventually contribute to the July 20, 1944 assassination plot, the Valkyrie conspiracy led by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg and other officers who believed Hitler was leading Germany to total destruction. The battle also had broader strategic effects. Japan, watching from the east, abandoned any plans to attack the Soviet Union from Manchuria. This allowed Stalin to transfer Siberian divisions westward, reinforcing the European front without fear of a two-front war. Resistance movements across occupied Europe took heart from Stalingrad. If the mighty Wehrmacht could be defeated in the east, perhaps liberation was possible in the west. French, Polish, Yugoslav, and other partisan groups intensified their operations. The Grand Alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union was solidified. Stalingrad proved the Soviets were not only surviving but winning, making them a credible partner in defeating Nazi Germany. This cooperation, however uneasy, paved the way for D-Day and the liberation of Western Europe. The human cost of Stalingrad remains almost incomprehensible even today. Conservative estimates suggest 1.1 million Soviet military casualties, 800,000 Axis military casualties, 40,000 to 50,000 Soviet civilian deaths total. Nearly 2 million human beings, it was one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Entire generations of young men were destroyed. Families across Europe and the Soviet Union were torn apart by losses that could never be recovered. The fate of the German prisoners adds another layer of tragedy. Of the 91,000 taken into Soviet captivity at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 ever returned home. The rest died in prison camps from disease, malnutrition, overwork, and abuse. Their suffering continued years after the guns fell silent. For Germany, Stalingrad became not just a military defeat but a national trauma. The battle inspired countless books, films, and artworks, often depicting it as a symbol of futility, the destruction of a generation, and the folly of Hitler's ambitions. Soviet and later Russian culture embraced Stalingrad differently. It became the ultimate symbol of the Great Patriotic War, the story of how ordinary Soviet citizens withstood impossible odds and turned the tide of history. Veterans of Stalingrad were honored as heroes for the rest of their lives. The ruins of Stalingrad produced haunting artifacts that survive in museums today. Personal letters from German soldiers, never sent, expressing despair and longing for home. Soviet propaganda leaflets urging surrender. Weapons, helmets, and equipment preserved in the frozen ground, discovered decades later during construction. Photographs from the battle show apocalyptic scenes, skeletal buildings, frozen corpses, hollow-eyed soldiers. These images became iconic representations of war's horror, used in countless histories and documentaries. From a military perspective, Stalingrad offers enduring lessons that are still studied in military academies worldwide. First, the danger of overreach. Hitler's obsession with capturing a city for symbolic reasons led him to commit resources to an urban battle that negated German advantages in mobile warfare. The Wehrmacht's strength lay in rapid maneuver, not grinding urban combat. Second, the critical importance of logistics. The failure to properly supply the encircled Sixth Army doomed it. Göring's promise to supply the pocket by air was never realistic, yet Hitler based his strategic decisions on this fantasy. Third, the need for flexibility. Hitler's rigid no-retreat orders prevented Paulus from breaking out when escape was still possible. Military doctrine requires commanders to adapt to changing situations, but Nazi ideology made retreat unthinkable. Fourth, the power of defensive determination. The Soviet decision to hold Stalingrad at all costs, though it resulted in horrific casualties, achieved its strategic objective. The city became a trap that consumed the German Sixth Army. Finally, the effectiveness of operational deception. Operation Uranus succeeded partly because the Soviets concealed their preparations so effectively. The Germans remained focused on the city while Soviet armies assembled for the encirclement. Beyond military lessons, Stalingrad stands as a reminder of war's human cost. The suffering endured by soldiers and civilians alike, starvation, freezing, wounds without treatment, psychological trauma, demonstrates the absolute horror of total war. The battle also illustrates the dangers of totalitarian ideology. Hitler's personal prestige became more important than the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. His refusal to accept military reality, driven by ideological conviction and personal pride, led directly to catastrophe. In the year between August 1942 and February 1943, on the banks of the Volga River, something fundamental changed in World War II. The German Wehrmacht, which had seemed unstoppable, which had conquered nations from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, was broken. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a crucible where the Nazi Empire's ambitions met their limit, where the Red Army transformed from a force in retreat to one advancing toward ultimate victory, where millions of lives were consumed in a struggle that would reshape the 20th century. The ruins of Stalingrad became a graveyard for Hitler's dreams of conquest. The frozen corpses scattered across the steppe, the prisoners marching into captivity, the silent radios that would never again transmit orders, all testified to the magnitude of the defeat. From those ruins, a new reality emerged. The Soviet Union, brutalized but unbroken, began its march westward toward Berlin. The Wehrmacht, still powerful but shattered in spirit, began its long retreat toward final defeat. Stalingrad showed the world that Nazi Germany could be defeated, that courage and determination, even at terrible cost, could overcome seemingly impossible odds, that the tide of history could be turned by those willing to pay any price for freedom. The echoes of Stalingrad's gunfire faded long ago. The ruins have been rebuilt into a modern city. The survivors have passed into history. But the lessons remain. Stalingrad reminds us that human willpower, even when battered and starved and frozen, can change the course of history. That ordinary people, Soviet factory workers, German conscripts, soldiers from a dozen nations, caught in extraordinary circumstances, are capable of both terrible suffering and remarkable endurance. The memorials that rise over the Volga, the eternal flame, the motherland calls statue, the preserved ruins, stand as witnesses to sacrifice that defies comprehension. They honor not just the victors, but all who died in that frozen hell. Stalingrad was where Nazi Germany went to die. Not immediately, not all at once, but fatally. The Wehrmacht fought for 2 more years, but after Stalingrad, the question was not whether Germany would lose, but when. For those who fought there, whether German or Soviet, whether they survived or fell, Stalingrad was an experience that transcended ordinary human understanding. They lived through hell and emerged transformed, if they emerged at all. This is the legacy of Stalingrad, a testament to war's horror, to human endurance, to the terrible price of totalitarian ambition. A reminder that the tide of history turns on the broken bodies of millions, that freedom's preservation demands sacrifice beyond measure. The battle that saved Europe was fought by those who refused to yield, who held every brick and beam, who froze and starved but would not surrender. Their story, preserved in ruins and monuments and memory, ensures that Stalingrad will never be forgotten. On the banks of the Volga, where factories once hummed and a city once thrived, where millions fought and died, the course of the 20th century was determined. That is why we remember. That is why Stalingrad endures in history as the place where Nazi Germany's advance was finally, definitively, permanently stopped. And from those frozen ruins, the liberation of Europe began.